actually going to be a shorter exam than what I usually give because we're basically a good chapter behind. And I usually don't give a take-home on the first one, but it's one of those circumstances where this time I actually am going to give a take-home on the first one. And for both of the classes, just to stress this, originally I had the take-home due tomorrow. I've backed the take-home up so that it's due the first Thursday after we get back from spring break. So please focus on the study. And I found that sometimes if there's a little bit of question as far as time, people will do a really good job on the take-home and then they'll bomb the actual exam, which is really not the point behind giving a take-home, you know. So that's what I'm going to do with that. For today, basically what I wanted to do is run through the study guides and things like this, and just to get a sense of what kind of questions that y'all had. It's for the morning class tomorrow. Obviously, y'all start at 9:30. I think I'm going to be in there at about 8:30 tomorrow for y'all, 8:30 until 11-ish. So you'll have plenty of time, in theory, a little bit more than 2 hours if you want to come in early. The 11 o'clock, I have a room reserved for y'all if you're in the 11 o'clock. So we'll go 11 to 12:15, and then I have a room reserved from 12:15 to 1. So you're also basically going to have 2 hours on this, so there shouldn't be any time pressure. It's going to be looking at about 100 points, probably about 2/3 of which is going to be multiple choice, 1/3 of which is going to be short answers. And to just give you a sense, and both of y'all are basically in the same place. I think there's one article difference between the two of you, but we'll just go ahead and start with the first chapter with nations. And I'll just pull up the study guide terms on this. Do you have any questions about any of the terms from either, well, let's start with chapter 4, because obviously it looks like it's bigger. Any questions about any of the terms from the states chapter? Not everybody at once. It's going to be a really long review session if we do. Okay, what was polity? Oh, it's a bad sign. Go ahead, Salsa.
A way to show support, to be in favor or against something.
A way to show support or to be in favor or against something.
Yeah.
Can you narrow that down for me a little bit?
Like-minded groups.
Like-minded groups. If you remember from very early in the class, a polity was a like-minded group. And you could be in favor of something, or you could be a like-minded group in the sense that you are against something. Do you remember any of the articles that were linked with polity, or you could link with polity?
The taco stand?
The taco stand article is an excellent one. Take a good look at the taco stand article, because if you remember in that, the taco stand article gave a series of examples of laws that were designed basically to attack Hispanics living in the United States. Do you remember any of those laws? I mean, there's one obvious one from the taco stand article.
So it's going to be like, the exam's going to be like this, like the articles in depth, I guess.
That's what I'm asking, yeah.
Not understand.
So what were some of the examples of the laws from the taco stand article?
They couldn't have a taco stand?
Yeah, they banned taco stands. That was one. Do you remember any of the others?
Oh yeah. In Nashville. Oh wait, no. In Philadelphia, there was a sub shop, and the owner hung up a sign that says, "If you're going to order, speak English."
If you're going to order, speak English. If you remember, we had a discussion, I think, in both classes that was talking about if a local government should be allowed to only provide services in English, like forms for government services, or did they have to provide an interpreter? If you remember, there was the Kansas law that said that we don't want Hispanics sitting on their front porches because that's what Hispanics do, and that was quoting from the article. That's not me saying this. So be able to give me examples of this. There was another example. If that's an anti-one, I think I had also mentioned to you an article that I had never used before until this semester that was an example of something in favor, a polity of like-minded individuals that were in favor of something. Do you remember that one? It was maybe the most lopsided vote that we had in both classes because people were very much against doing a certain thing.
Was it the dad with, oh wait, no, the dad with the...
Wasn't the dad one. Go ahead, Annie. Wasn't the assisted suicide one? It was the Redskin name change article. If you remember, when you talk about a group of like-minded individuals, we could be talking about Democrats or Republicans. We could be talking about a polity being the review session polity, because right now y'all are all like-minded people. I also mentioned to you that day Red Sox Nation, for example, or the Washington Redskin fans could be considered a polity. And I believe the young lady, it was Faye in the 930 class that had actually made the point, only time people care, it was either Faye or Tanya in the 11, but only when the Redskins are losing do people talk about the name change. When they're winning, nobody thinks about it at all because we're more focused on rooting for the team. So these would be examples of polity, and be able to link articles to this. As you go through this, those top 4 definitions across the top, political science, politics, politicians, and polity, will probably be pretty small, but they are specific definitions. So political science is going to be the study of politics, of politicians, and of polity. Polity is that like-minded group idea. What is a politician? Anybody? Go ahead, enthusiasm.
Someone who's in or around the government that's influencing policy.
Somebody that's in or around the government that's influencing policy. So President Obama is a good example of a politician. But you could go in other examples as well, right? Do you want to give me any?
I mean, like lobbyist groups.
Lobbyist groups. You're an editor. The press could conceivably be considered a political body. We could get into governors or state senators. We could go on and on with this. Do you remember the article that I gave you that was the example of a politician? And it was a controversial politician. What's that? Go ahead, say it.
Gingrich.
Newt Gingrich was. What was the Newt Gingrich article dealing with? Go ahead, Annie.
He wanted to have kids start working, I think, at the age of 12. wasn't it?
He believed that we needed to reestablish the work ethic of young kids by actually allowing them to work and go to school, or work at their school at the same time that they go. Can you give me any arguments in favor or against that article? Anybody? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, not that I'm in favor, but some could argue that that would provide an early start for kids to learn a good work ethic, and so then they would be more motivated and wouldn't continue the cycle of poverty that they had been stuck in.
Gingrich's big argument was that we need to attack this with kids at young ages, and we've got to rebuild the work ethic. And both classes kind of seem to suggest that Americans were a little fat on themselves. Americans really weren't as motivated as they used to be. So let's get the kids working. Let's give them a chance to earn some money. Let's let them understand the value of work. Maybe even begin to gain a trade. Go ahead, Salsa.
But they would also be taking other people's jobs and giving them to the kids who they wouldn't even pay as much as them.
That's right. You could argue, and that could be a positive or a negative, because he said in this, the negative is you're taking other people's jobs, other people's unionized careers with benefits. The positive of that is that this is going to save the school district money by basically cycling these lower paying jobs out to the little kids. It mentioned in there, do you want little kids frying burgers or cutting grass or doing things like this, which could endanger them? Does this take away their school time? Read through that article and kind of have an idea of point counterpoint, because that child labor law article or that child labor policy idea was one that we spent some time on. And there was also the Gingrich link in there where it lays out some things about that story as well. That was politicians. What was politics? Anybody remember politics? Because I didn't have an article for this one. Go ahead.
Organized control over a human community, particularly state.
I'm saying organized control again.
Over a human community.
Organized control over a human community. The processes and institutions by which people govern themselves is government. The results of those processes and institutions is really the politics. And I believe I had contacted or basically compared this to the idea of a flower and dirt. You know, people don't like being political, but with this said, you need dirt in order to make a flower grow. You need politics in order to get policies passed. And actually, I did have some examples with articles. Do y'all remember any of the politics articles? Because if you remember on this, the other way that I prefaced this was by saying different people could look at the exact same issue and they could see something completely different. Do you remember any of the articles? The Redskins article was one for this.
The acid.
The acid article. Go ahead, Muhammad. What was the acid article?
The eye for an eye.
An eye for an eye. Talking about Islamic retribution. What was the story in that article?
Some dude threw acid on this lady's face because she didn't want him, so she got a chance to get revenge on him by throwing acid on his face.
Yeah, this woman actually sued under Islamic retribution. And if you remember, the young lady was an Iranian college student. She was at the university. She helped out a young man, another student there, who was probably a little socially awkward, didn't have a lot of friends. He fell in love with her. He kept asking her to marry him. And finally, what did she say? What do all women seemingly say when they are tired of answering questions about dates?
She's already engaged.
I've got someone else. And then at that point, he kind of blurted back, well, if I can't have you, then nobody will. And then a couple of days later, he tapped her on the shoulder and threw acid on her face. What was the result of the acid being thrown on her face? Go ahead, Annie.
Well, she ended up going to the religious court and they allowed her to like drop acid in one of his eyes.
Do you remember how many drops?
5.
5 drops. So originally, okay, so she was blinded, she was disfigured, and there was some hope for a while, but there's really not hope anymore. And all of this happened when she was basically in her 20s, maybe late 20s. So once she sued for Islamic retribution, the charge or the return on this is that she would actually, in a controlled environment, be able to drop 5 drops of acid in both of his eyes. In both of his eyes. So she's not going to be able to dump a bucket on him, but somebody would basically guide her hand and then they would squeeze this off. It was appealed, right?
Well, because she like went to visit him at the jail or whatever.
What happened on appeal? Well, wait, so the original court said you can drop 5 drops in both eyes.
But then they said you can only do 1 because 2 women's eyes are equal to 1 man's.
That's what they said on appeal. Now, there's a couple things with this. On the one hand, this was a case that was dealing with women's rights. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Women's rights are a big deal. And they were basically making a statement because women don't typically win this case, and she did. The second part of it, though, was when it was appealed, 2 women's eyes equal 1 man's eye, and so she was going to be allowed to drop 5 drops in one of his eyes. Did she end up doing it? No, and there was a sense that maybe when she didn't do this, this was also a slap towards women's rights, because saying 2 women's eyes is only equal to 1 man's eye, that seems like that's a problem. Take a good look at that Iranian article dealing with Islamic retribution, because that was actually one that we spent time on in both classes. What's the difference between nation and state? This was when we first started to get into the chapter. Go ahead, enthusiasm.
The nation is like the people who identify as a group that share culture and language and common history kind
Okay.
of thing. But the state is actually the like structure of the nation.
The structure or the
government.
Government, yeah. When you think about nations, we're talking about people. And when you start talking about people, what we're saying is, you mentioned some of the attributes. A shared history, a shared language, a shared heritage, a shared culture, a shared religion. Could be any number of things. But the idea is that the nation is the people. The idea behind the state is, you're absolutely right, it's the government. It's what actually rules over the people in that regard. Now, putting these two together, which one came first, the chicken or the egg? Which one came first, the nation or the state?
Usually the state.
Everybody thinks that it's usually the nation. And I thought it was the nation until I read this chapter. But actually, it says that it's typically the state. And the example, do you remember the example that they had given of this? There was a really obvious one. The United States. Because when you think about it, we didn't become Americans until after we got that Constitution and until after the government was formed. So that's nations and state. Characteristics of effective, weak, and failed states, that's actually in one of the boxes from the chapter. So maybe take a look at that. I don't want to spend too much time on that. What's legitimacy? Go ahead, Annie.
Not feeling that the population should follow the rules of the government because it is generally a good system.
A little bit louder.
Mass feeling that the population should follow the rules of the government because it is generally a good system.
Yeah, the basic idea behind legitimacy is not that you got power, but it's that you got power properly. You got power according to the rules, this kind of a thing. So that's what legitimacy is. Do y'all remember the article that dealt specifically with legitimacy? Somebody in one of the classes yesterday said that they were from this country. The Ghana article, yeah, it is the Ghana article. And what was it that happened in the Ghana article? Not everybody at once. Go ahead.
They had to redo an election 3 times because it was so close on the third one. The other guy just said.
Do you remember like what the spread was on the election?